Hello, and welcome to the webinar Advancing State Policy to Support Students with Dyslexia. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Joey Hedger, and I'm a program manager at the National Association of State Boards of Education. In a moment, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Kimberly Stockton, to kick off our session, as well as introduce the excellent panelists we have lined up today. There will be time for questions later on during the presentation, so if you have any, please put them in the Q&A box. Also, feel free to introduce yourself using the chat box and look for links that we'll be sharing there. Before I begin, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing at NASB around dyslexia and early literacy. So NASB is a membership organization representing state boards of education, which exists in 46 states, 4 U.S. territories, and the District of Columbia. State boards of education have varying approaches and authorities to advancing and adopting state education policies, so we find it very important to elevate state board voices and promote collaboration so our members can learn from each other on best practices and apply to their own state context. Next slide, please. In 2022, we formed the Early Literacy Work Group as a way for state board members from across the U.S. to learn from national experts in other states about early literacy trends and effective policies and practices that increase young children's reading success. We had board members join from 14 states and have been meeting over the past couple of years, both virtually and in person, to continue ongoing collaboration between state board members on the latest issues they're facing. Last October, we held a co-convening in San Diego with our partners at the National Conference of State Legislators, NCSL, where our members were able to come together with state legislators to discuss and collaborate on early math and literacy. Cross-state collaboration is key to advancing these policies, as I'm sure you'll hear more later on. And we had an excellent event that I'm sure some of you were also at. Next slide, please. The work group also outlined 7 policy buckets that we identified as priorities to further explore around addressing early literacy needs from a state perspective. These include supports for educators, stakeholder communications, instruction and curriculum, assessment and screening, retention and intervention, licensure and certification, and alignment of policy around areas such as science of reading. So building off these topics, NASB recently released 2 publications, a policy update on multifaceted supports for teachers and a state innovation on the work of Georgia and Massachusetts to advance dyslexia screening and intervention policies. The webinar today builds off of that work to highlight further state successes in addressing the needs of students with dyslexia. I'll put a link in the chat shortly so you can read about those later on. As you can probably tell, we at NASB are extremely proud of the work of state boards in the early literacy space, as well as in supporting comprehensive dyslexia policy. If you're a state board member who's interested in learning more, please reach out. I'll include my email address at the end of the webinar. We hope to keep working with state board members and more to ensure that the youngest learners have that resources they need to be able to read. And now I'll pass it over to Kimberly Stockton, who will introduce our fantastic panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing all that background. It's really great to hear about your work and the plans to move forward this critical topic across the country through the power of your organization. My name is Dr. Kimberly Stockton, and I'm a senior advisor with Lexia, and it's my pleasure to be here today to really dig into this subject. Many of us have heard of dyslexia, and we've also been following the progress of the adoption of dyslexia legislation across the U.S. Now, as we begin this discussion today, I wanted to level set with a shared definition of the term and a bit of history. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin and is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. Now, these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. The history of dyslexia can be traced back to the late 1800s, when scientists began discussing the existence of such phenomena, and it was originally called word blindness. Dr. Samuel T. Orton, a neuropathologist, presented a paper in the United States in 1925 that advanced his theory of a cerebral connection to dyslexia. Dr. Orton was also one of the first researchers to advocate phonics instruction for those with dyslexia. And in the 60s, the first consensus definition of dyslexia was formulated. And during this latter part of the timeline, the US federal government began addressing dyslexia in policy. Now, in the 90s, the development of neuroimaging technologies enabled dyslexia research to make significant advances. One commonly used method for brain imaging is fMRI, which measures signs of neural activation using a strong magnet to pinpoint blood flow. Now, studies using functional imaging technologies that compared the brain activation flows in readers with and without dyslexia show potentially important patterns of differences during reading, as you can see here in the image. Now, the good news is we can rewire the brain. The National Institutes of Health and the World Health Organization estimate that only 2 to 5% of young readers have cognitive impairments that are severe enough to prevent them from acquiring the skills they need to become fluent readers. So, by these estimates, we can say that roughly 95% of students have the cognitive capacity to learn to read when taught using explicit and systematic instruction in critical components of language. We know that early intervention is critical to introduce effective instruction at a time when children are still developing neurological pathways. Now, with that very brief background, we're here to speak with experts to learn how state boards of education can convene stakeholder champions, identify essential components for strong student-focused dyslexia policies, and hear about the work and some of the barriers our panelists have had to overcome in their own settings as they lifted this. And now it's my honor to introduce our esteemed panel. Jason Downey was appointed by Georgia Governor Brian B. Kemp as Georgia's 8th Congressional District Representative on the Georgia State Board of Education in April 2019. He has served as chairman and vice chairman of the state board, as well as chair of budget and state schools committees. Downey previously served as an elected board member for Macon-Bibb County School District in Middle Georgia from 2013 to 2017. Jason graduated from Marshall University with a BA in Communication Studies and from Mercer University Law School with a JD. While Downey practices law, his wife Connie is a 24-year elementary school counselor, and their daughter Kate is a 10th grader at Jones County High School. Kimberly Liedl is the state government relations manager at Lexia. She has over 2 decades of experience as a policy and government relations advisor, working with state legislative and executive branches across the nation, including her work as a policy director to a Wisconsin governor. Kimber is passionate about literacy, both personally and professionally, having seen the impact of science of reading trained educators and curriculum with her own children. Megan Potente is co-state director for Decoding Dyslexia California, a grassroots movement dedicated to improving access to evidence-based literacy instruction as a fundamental civil right. She has been active in DDCA leadership for over 4 years, during which time DDCA has achieved 2 major legislative milestones for California, including improved literacy teaching standards and required K-2 universal screening for reading difficulties, including risk of dyslexia. Megan is a former 20-year elementary educator and parent, sister, and aunt to people with dyslexia. And Kareem Weaver is a co-founder and executive director of Fulcrum, which partners with stakeholders to improve reading results for students. He is the Oakland NAACP's second vice president and chair of its education committee. His advocacy is featured in the film, The Right to Read. Mr. Weaver previously served as New Leaders Executive Director of the Western Region and was an award-winning teacher and administrator. He has undergraduate degrees from Morehouse College and a master's in clinical community psychology from the University of South Carolina. Mr. Weaver believes in the potential of all students, the brotherhood of man, and the importance of service above self. His educational heroine for literacy instruction is the late Marva Collins. I'd like to welcome our entire panel today. And as we get started, I really wanted to talk a little bit about your journey to this work. I wanted for all of us to hear kind of how you came to be passionate about this subject. So I'd like to do kind of a brief round robin and just go through and have the panel, each of you talk to us a little bit about how you came to this work. And I'd like to start with Mr. Weaver with Kareem, please.
Thank you. Good to be here. And my journey is not a very complicated story. I've always wanted to be an educator. But in college, I befriended a young man, a fellow student in Morehouse. His name was Ennis Cosby, and he was Bill Cosby's son, and he had dyslexia. And Ennis he was my study partner. He was a terrible student, horrible, drove me crazy. However, one summer he went to this summer program at Landmark College, and I don't know what they did. All I know is he came back a new man, and he was getting A's and B's. And I was like, what in the world? What happened? Was in a positive way. He told me, he's like, Kareem, I know you want to end the school to prison pipeline, but if you have dyslexia and you don't know it, or you don't know how to deal with it, you're already in jail. It's just different. And that framed my thinking about this topic, and that merged the idea of social justice with advocacy for dyslexia. And on the back end, I found out that my daughter, my youngest daughter, is dyslexic. Come to find out, many people in my family are dyslexic, but it shook me because it brought the reality of it back home. Matter of fact, if you don't mind putting that picture up, she drew this image for me digitally to help me understand her world. And I realized, oh, I really don't know what's going on. I really don't know the implications and what's going on behind the scenes. And as she said to me, Dad, you're likely living in two worlds. And so that spurned me on. Thank you for showing that. It spurned me on to dig deeper and try to understand, to inform my advocacy on behalf of kids and anyone who really they need the support. And so grateful to partner with groups like Fulcrum and others in community, including the NAACP, who in 2014 wrote a national resolution on dyslexia advocacy, on dyslexia and the advocacy that's needed. So those are the things that brought me to this space. I'm really happy to be of service in this area.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for sharing that powerful image. It really, I think it helps to shine a light on, why we do this work, and to understand that we all, our brains are different and we function different just through the power of that discussion and really hearing those stories that we can begin to understand a little bit. And I know that, Megan, you talk about the people in your life that have been associated with dyslexia or have those tendencies. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to this work?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me and having DDCA part of this important conversation. So this issue is really personal for me as well. Like so many, I was an educator who did not learn about the science of reading in my teacher prep. And when I started teaching in 1999, I didn't know that it was called the science of reading at that time, but it was very evident from like the first few weeks of school that I didn't know how to help the fourth graders in my class who couldn't read. I didn't know how to help them. And that was really hard to experience as a beginning teacher. Because of course I wanted to be there for my students. I wanted to be there to teach them to read because I grew up with a brother who really struggled with reading. So I knew that I didn't have the skills or the knowledge. I went back to school after finishing my master's and my teaching certificate and my undergrad. I went back to school to learn the science of reading, what I hadn't learned. And I gained that knowledge. And that was incredible. It changed my professional world. But then, fast forward some years and I have a child with dyslexia, and I'm working in a school district that is a balanced literacy district. And my job is to, train teachers in all of the reading workshop pieces and how to do running records. And it was really difficult for me to be in that context where my son, we had pulled him from the public school system because we couldn't make it work for him. And he was finally, after years of struggle, he was learning to read. He finally had access to structured literacy that he needed. And it changed his world. He was finally learning to read. Any parent who's been in this position knows what that's like to have a child struggle and then for it to click. It was incredible. So anyway, I was immersed in this world where it was very clear that the system needs to change. We need to change how teachers are taught. We need to change how children are taught to read. And so that's that's my story. And we've come a long way, but we have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for sharing. And I think many of us as educators, we tell that same story that, I went through my undergrad, did my teaching credential, my student teaching, got a master's, got another master's, and still it was not about the science of reading. That's not what I was focused on. So I think that, as an educator, you also sit and say, I want to help these children, but I wasn't given those tools. I wasn't given that background. And then as a parent, you see it happening. And luckily you were in a position to, help your son, but we want to make sure that every child has that opportunity and every teacher has the tools and the skills. So thank you for your work. And thank you so much for sharing. I know we're going to dig more deeply into your story in just a bit as well. And Jason, I think that, you have this background that's so wonderful because we hear about, your work in policy and legislation, but then also you have a wife who is in education and obviously a daughter. So can you talk a little bit about your journey to this work?
Yeah, I guess the background that I bring is sort of the down and dirty side of it, the political side of it. We hate to say that we should keep politics out of public education, but the reality is it's at the forefront. And particularly here in Georgia, we've had a busy session, both the 23 and the 24 years, and a very active governor in Governor Kemp, who has been at the forefront of and trying to push new policies and new ideas, new innovative ways to revolutionize public education, K-12. And so that's sort of, my story is not nearly as interesting as Megan's or Kareem's. Mine is more of a political story, I guess. And when I was a kid, I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be a pediatrician. I wanted to work with children. And then I got to college at Marshall University in West Virginia, not far from where I grew up. And I'm a product of public schools. But I went to Marshall and I took some science classes and didn't do well. So I changed my major and did what everybody that can't hack it going to pre-med does and go to law school. So I went to law school. But I moved to Georgia and married a South Georgia girl who's an educator. And she's been a counselor for 24 years at the same school at Dames Ferry Elementary in Jones County. And immediately got involved in sitting on their local school council. And in the state of Georgia, we have a law that's created to get the community more involved, stakeholders, business leaders, parents. And I sat on that school council for a number of years. And through that, then an opportunity came about for me to run for a local school board seat in Bibb County, which is where Macon, Georgia is located. And through that, I continued to make political connections with our state legislators. I began to learn about how the sausages are made, as we like to say in politics, and transition that to when Governor Kemp was elected in 2019. I was one of his first 3 appointees to the State Board of Education to represent the state of Georgia, and particularly my congressional district. And so the background that I bring is interesting because I see things at a local school level, particularly at an elementary school in a rural community. I served on a mid-sized system board of education, so I understand how the local control aspect works, particularly here in Georgia. And now I'm serving on the State Board of Education. I served the past 2 years as chair. And so that's the background that I bring, sort of, I guess, getting the deal done, if you will, because the specific aspects of it at the school level and at the LEA, at the local education agency level, what I'm trying to do is talk to people, sometimes legislators that don't know anything about public education, and trying to educate them so that they can understand why we need to get this across the finish line. And then the down and dirty part of it is sometimes you have to give and take a little bit, and that's unfortunate. But that's kind of where I am. And again, it's an honor to be here today. And I hope I can enlighten some people about the process and the journey.
Absolutely. Having your expertise here, I think this helps all of us, because as we look at, the science of reading, as we look at dyslexia legislation, we are seeing, 37 states in the District of Columbia have science of reading legislation. Every state has some type of dyslexia legislation. And really what's happening is we're seeing there is a trajectory. We're moving from the dyslexia legislation to the science of reading. And, so it really is important to have you sitting here and talking to us, because while we did see a separation, I think we're now finding when we're working together and we're trusting that we can have these conversations, it's really helping to move forward this idea of lifting literacy and giving every student and teacher the opportunity. So we really appreciate your perspective. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn to Kimber Liedl. And Kimber, I definitely want to hear a little bit about you, because you're kind of marrying a couple of these worlds, your legislative background and also your background as a parent.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to join today's discussion. As you mentioned during the intros, literacy and dyslexia are issues that are very near and dear to my heart, both personally and professionally. So kind of dovetailing off some of our earlier presenters that are joining us today. I've worked in literacy policy for many years in Wisconsin. I had been a policy director for Governor Walker, for the Senate Majority Leader in Wisconsin, and worked on some of our early literacy legislation in Wisconsin back in 2012, 2013, implementing, say, a reading screener, a parental notification piece in Wisconsin law, and then have seen the impact of those laws on my own children. So of my 3 kiddos, I have one who is dyslexic. So my daughter was identified as dyslexic when she was 6 years old. And it was, again, thanks to that screener that was required that showed her needing extreme intervention. She's only at 5% at the beginning of 1st grade, and the teachers pulled my husband and I into the classroom, and we talked about it and had the neuropsych done. And sure enough, she's dyslexic. And after 2 hours of intervention a week, year round for 4 years, she is now reading and spelling above grade level at the age of 11. And not only has it transformed her and her academics, but also her social emotional well-being. And it's been quite the journey for our family. And like I said, seeing both the policy side of it and the personal side of it has really helped drive my advocacy. So prior to joining Lexia a year ago, I had partnered with Decoding Dyslexia Wisconsin. And again, I can't say enough about the power of the different networks in the states and the grassroots efforts of parents and their children in helping to transform and bring about change in states. And so I had partnered with Decoding Dyslexia Wisconsin and other stakeholders to help write legislation 3 years ago that didn't quite make its way all the way through the legislative process, but then it was brought back and expanded this session, and Governor Evers signed it into law last summer. So it's just been quite a rewarding journey for us. And now I'm thrilled to be able to be with the government relations team at Lexia and talk about both personal and political changes throughout the country as a part of my job. Thanks again for inviting me.
Yes, no, thank you. And thanks for your perspective. We're definitely, looking at kind of all those different worlds kind of merging and colliding and coming together. And so as we think about that, I wanted to ask Jason, when we really look at this, why should states consider this advancing this dyslexia policy? What can you tell us about this work? Like, what are the benefits? What are kind of the things that are happening in that?
Well, when we think about public education and what we're trying to do, and again, I hate to bring this all back to politics, but the political side of things, our goal in K-12 is to provide children with the best education to prepare them for a career or college. And if a child is left behind, and I hate to use that phrase because it brings back some bad memories for a lot of us, but if we cannot figure out how to assist a child with the most basic thing, which is reading, which impacts every single class and every single trade education that they may have in every way. If we can't attack that at the earliest level possible, we lose the child. And so then we have high school dropout rates, and it becomes a burden on society. And that's the selling point, I think, when we talk about being able to enact legislation or enact policy, that because the question you always get is, what's going to cost money, right? Yes, it is. But the payoff and everybody wants a return on investment in government. They want to know that if you're spending and allocating, earmarking money, what's the return on investment going to be? But you can't really measure what the return on investment is for making sure that the child is properly educated. But you can say we have X number of children that will never be able to read at grade level or can't read at grade level for whatever reason. So if we can enact policy, they can become productive members of society because they can actually read the tests in math class. And so we start digging deeper and we see a child that maybe is not succeeding across the board, and it all comes back to some sort of neurodivergence. Maybe they're dyslexic, maybe they're not reading on grade level. That's why it's so important for states, and I'm glad that so many states are doing what we've done in Georgia, which is enacting policy to making sure that no child is left behind when it comes to literacy.
Absolutely. And I think, your idea of that return on investment, it's kind of it's a longitudinal story as well, correct? I mean, we have to think about what does it look like when we have children, students, teenagers leaving our system that are not literate? What does that look like? What happens now in society? So we have to kind of play that out. Do you think, Jason?
And that's exactly right. And I think from an economic development standpoint, education is the best tool that we have. And so if we have a robust literacy program, it stems up from there. So when our economic development teams are going to other countries or other states and trying to steal business away from other states, I think it's a great tool, especially when you can look at new legislation or legislation that may be 3 or 4 years old, and you can show the results, you can show the improvements, you can say, look at, because there's always going to be a bottom quartile, right? Well, what you're trying to do is shift that entire number all the way up so the bottom quartile is better than the bottom quartile somewhere else. And when you sell this legislation, when you sell these ideas and these policies to people that don't understand public education, it's the elevator speech, right? You got to tell them, well, if we invest X number of dollars, which ends up being X dollars per pupil, here's the return you're going to get, because then they're going to be at grade level. They're going to be able to understand what's done in other courses, and they're going to graduate on time. They're going to learn a trade. They're going to learn a skill. They're going to go to college. They're going to stay in our state, and they're going to attract more business.
There we go. Okay. So we're getting that's the way that you talk about it, which it's interesting to hear the different way that you have to position it. And I think it's important for us to understand that. And I wonder, Kareem, if you kind of have these conversations and what that looks like when you're having a conversation of why states or local education agencies, districts, why should they consider adopting and advancing dyslexia policy and also the structured literacy science of reading? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think to boil it down to a nutshell is that states have to make a decision. Are you going to wait to intervene, or are you going to be preventative? I'm sure you all are familiar with the discrepancy model, whereby you see the difference between where students perform versus where they're expected, and after a couple of years, you can identify them. That's also known as a wait to fail model. So the push for states is to say all our kids actually means all our kids from the very beginning, not when that house is on fire. And that takes a culture shift for many state governments and just for many constituencies, because we're used to marginalizing the students. And so really the battle, legislatively speaking, around policy, both school board level and at the state house, is around what's expected. And in the school building, the question is tier 1 or regular classroom instruction. And that's how that rolls down from a policy sense. It's, do we wait until the alarm bells are going off? And in the school building, that means, is our tier 1 instruction what it needs to be? Or do we wait for them to fail and then intervene in tier 2 and tier 3 and intervention, et cetera, or maybe special ed? And what many of us have come to realize is access to a free and appropriate public education means being considered in core instruction. And from a policy standpoint, from the state house, to the city council, to the school board meeting. It means that we are ensuring kids have equitable and consistent access to the instruction they need on the front end rather than the back end. And we can get into the logistics of policy and the different, but just high level, that's what it is. When do you intervene? And if we're going to say all our kids, then it has to be all our kids from the very beginning. And that's both a policy and implementation challenge that we have to address.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely. So really, it's this, like, instead of it being intervention, prevention, let's get in front of it. Let's identify. And I know that, this work is happening. I know that it's something that, Megan, you have really focused and DTCA has really focused on. So California has had a long journey to see dyslexia legislation improved and approved. So what was the hurdle that had to be overcome? What advice do you have for others, and kind of what's happening right now for you, Megan? Can you share that?
Sure. So yes, it took California 8 years with 5 bills and 2 governors before we could pass our universal screening legislation. And, that's really just the first step. We know that so much more needs to be done. This required building awareness over time. And, then we built a momentum and we brought more people on board. We just kept fighting. We really had to expose the problem. And I credit, so many in helping with this. Of course, the reporting of Emily Hanford was huge. I mean, it really helped people get it. Thank you to Kareem Weaver and his amazing film and all of the work that so many advocates do. It just took a really long time. And it took a while for people to recognize how dyslexia and literacy, how it all fits, right? But like, as you were just saying, as you were just saying, with early identification and prevention programs, as many states are now implementing, the number of children who are placed in special ed can be reduced by up to 70%. So, I mean, this is a huge return on investment to have preventative policy in place. So where we are now with California, as I said, we passed our universal screening legislation, which was a major accomplishment. And, we're beginning implementing that. But we are also now invested in passing comprehensive literacy legislation and we're really working hard on that. And again, it's a messaging thing, right? We are gaining momentum, but we have a fight ahead of us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know we're definitely watching it closely. I am here in California, and that's something that I'm reading about daily. So thank you for your work and the continued work for this. Now, as we look at this idea of dyslexia legislation, thinking about the stakeholders and science of reading and who needs to be consulted. Jason, I'm really curious if you can talk to us about what kind of groups need to be considered and brought in, and how do you build kind of this momentum, and how do you build a shared consensus? You mentioned collaboration and things like that. So what does that look like in this area?
I think the biggest thing, again, trying to get policy in the form of legislation passed is it's very network driven, right? It's very relationship driven. And so I've encouraged, when I was chair, one of the things I said was I encouraged all of our board members to have that we should, at any given time, every board member should be able to lay their phone down and have the cell phone number or the contact information of every single state legislator in the state of Georgia. And I think that's important because they need to be able to use us for, if we're not the subject matter expert, we can find one in 5 minutes for them. And so being that connector for state legislators, for the policymakers that have questions, being able to route them to the boots on the ground, the superintendents, the directors, ELA directors at the local systems. I think that's important. We also used a lot of outside groups like Decoding Dyslexia that have assisted us. We also have the Sandra Dunnigan Deal Center for Literacy, which is affiliated with one of our colleges here in Georgia. Getting all these outside groups involved that have a stake, that have skin in the game, and hearing all different sides of the equation. I think that's the biggest thing. You cannot just walk down a tunnel and have a narrow focus and that be it. You have to be open to having a multitude of ideas, because it's just like in the business world, a variety of ideas and competition creates success. And so that's what we're dealing with, because obviously what has been done in the past hasn't worked. That's why we're coming up with these ideas and trying to come up with new ideas for policy. So I think that's the biggest thing, is you've got to just blast it out on social media, contact all of your superintendents. We have regional support groups. They're called RESAs here in Georgia, right? And reaching out to our board of control and telling the superintendents, we need your help. We want your input. We want you to be involved in the decision-making process. I think that's the biggest thing. It's all about communication and networking, and that professional relationship and personal relationship that you have, so that you can connect the decision makers with the people, the boots on the ground, that are actually the ones that are going to have to be taking this policy and this legislation and implementing it at the school level, in the classroom level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the networking and, I think, looking at your RESAs, looking at, who is the subject matter expertise, having those people kind of like right there, ready to have this conversation. I mean, it goes back to one of the things I think, Megan, that you had mentioned is like, if we do this work, we're looking at the opportunity of like reducing this by 70%, or, we can find these students. So I think it's having that conversation. And then Kimber, I'm curious from your perspective as well, what stakeholders should be consulted? And I'm thinking now, like if you think locally, legislator, advocacy, parents, what are some of the examples that you've seen work in your area in this topic?
Absolutely. So dovetailing off of Jason's comments, that networking and communication is so essential in getting that message across to elected officials, and honestly getting them to understand what's going on in their state. I mean, so like in Wisconsin, a lot of legislators were shocked to find out that about half of our elementary schools were using 3Qing curriculum, but then getting them to understand, like, what does that look like? And that's where, again, going back to decoding dyslexia networks, having those parents, and quite frankly, like in Wisconsin, our Decoding Dyslexia Wisconsin network has thousands of parents strong throughout the whole state. So when they need to deploy them to reach out to their elected officials, they do a great job in reaching out to their senators and state reps and sharing their stories and talking about their personal story with their child in their local school district. Also, we talk about passing legislation, but then the importance is also actually implementing it. And so we have seen, even in those laws that I mentioned in Wisconsin that were passed 10 years ago, where sometimes they're not always following the law, essentially. And so that's where I think the parent perspective and those families are so valuable in sharing with legislators what's going on, changes that are needed, and helping them to understand the impact of the legislation that is in front of them. And that has helped to create that momentum, whether it is the Decoding Dyslexia parents and the children, as well as, school officials, school administrators, et cetera, in creating the momentum that actually then results in that bill eventually being signed, and keeping up the interest so that the implementation is true to the intent.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. We really talk about, we've obtained the information, we've begun to ingrain it. How do we maintain and sustain? How do we implement it? And I think, Kareem, you touched on that a little. So I wanted to talk to you about that when, Kimber mentioned like the oversight of the implementation. So the concrete action steps. So Kareem, can you talk about that for us? Like what is that? How do we make that happen? What are some of those important components or the attributes or the action steps that we take?
Concrete action steps. So there's different stakeholders, and for each stakeholder group, there's different things you can do. But in addition to starting with universal screening, so that we can move away from, subjective assignment of cause or explanation to why kids are or aren't being successful. We need evidence. We need to understand what's going on at the sub-skill level, not as a broad, they're doing this or that, but at the sub-skill level. So we need to have that, as well as good reporting instruments for parents and for teachers. We also need quality curriculum that leverages evidence-based strategies with the science of reading in tier 1. And that curriculum needs to be usable. So you can't just have a curriculum that's aligned to the science and research consensus. If nobody can use it, what's the point? It's just virtue signaling. It has to be something that can be implemented within the bounds of whatever the structure is. Many districts have a teacher's contract, they have a labor partner. And so you ought to be able to plan to fully implement that thing within the bounds of the preparation time that you're given. And so that way you structurally are preparing for students who might be further away from promise or opportunity. That includes a variety of different demographics and needs, not just dyslexic students, but you have to be able to fully implement the thing that you've chosen within those bounds, or else you're just hoping, and hope isn't exactly a strategy. We also need to have ongoing professional development, not just for teachers, but also for administrators, for district officials, and for board members. So we can talk about the science of reading and we can talk about evidence-based strategies, but if no one has had the opportunity to learn, then we're just virtue signaling. We don't want that. And so we want to make sure that people have opportunity to engage on the substance of the matter. And that includes making sure they have access to professional development, preferably with some sort of a compensation or stipend to value them for their time, but at different levels of entry. It's not just sending everyone to Orton Gillingham class or Lexia class or core class, which is like a graduate level class, but also having things that with a smaller lift. The reason why that's important to have those aligned opportunities, but at varying levels of bandwidth required, is because, educators, we're human beings and people are in different seasons of life. And many of these professional development opportunities are literally graduate level classes, which is great. And, if you have small children at home and you might have a special needs child, or you may be going through things personally or in your home, you may not be in that season of life, but you need to have an access point or an on-ramp so that you can get the basics and then join the community of learners at your school site. There are other things to do as well. Functionally, you need to have someone in the district who is in charge of literacy, where this is on their radar. And that person should not be very far from the superintendent and their cabinet. It can be the superintendent, the chief academic officer, or the next person down on the org chart. Other than that, it gets buried. And as any parent with a special needs child can tell you, that's our worst nightmare, when our cases get buried under paperwork and processes and timelines. That's what we cannot have, is delay. And so someone needs to be in charge in the system who can monitor, regulate, and implement in a timely way.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I love that idea of the access points and kind of the different level of the investment that it would be depending on who you are. At different times, people are at different levels, and we need to make sure there's a way for them to enter the conversation. And I love that you included administrators, board members, parents. I mean, it's the full community.
Right.
Absolutely.
It can't just fall on the teachers. It can't just fall on the teachers. They're learning as well. There's room on this ship for everyone. We all have to be pushing in the same direction.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to just pause briefly because I wanted to ask, as we have someone monitoring our chat and our questions, I wanted to ask Brandy, can you tell me if we have any questions that have come in and if they've been addressed to particular panelists?
We don't have any addressed to particular panelists. We do have, I'm wondering if somebody on your panel might want to answer this one though. Once a state enacts a dyslexia law, what are some of the key implementation steps? How can state boards support effective implementation, and what are the obstacles? So I think there's a few questions embedded that some of your panelists might be able to inform on.
Perfect. I'm looking for faces to see, I see Kimber is kind of perked up on that one. Did you need Brandy to repeat it, Kimber?
Yeah, Brandy, there were a few different questions within the question.
Yeah.
Would you please repeat
So
it?
once you've been successful and a state enacts a dyslexia law, what are some of the key implementation steps?
Well, I mean, it's lobbying at the different state level, as well as just the personal experience in Wisconsin. Legislators are eager to shove everything into something right away. And some of the keys are making sure that the implementation timeline is reasonable. I mean, everyone wants transformation overnight, but like Kareem said, it takes time training teachers, implementing new curriculum, etc., let alone if you, again, like a lot of the states with comprehensive dyslexia legislation then have a diagnostic piece that kicks in if children are screening below a certain percentage on their screener, and then trying to figure out then what are next steps after that, such as creating a independent reading plan for students in the school district, but then disseminating the information to school board members, the school districts, teachers, etc. It's providing those supports so that implementation can be successful. But open it up to other panelists who may have thoughts on that as well.
Absolutely. I think Megan has something she wants to add, so I'd love to.
Yeah, I can add that, you know, passing the law is really just the first step, and all of the involvement continues with the implementation. So for Decoding Dyslexia California, we have been very involved in this beginning implementation process of our screening law. So they just announced who's going to be in the expert panel. These are the people who will be responsible for selecting the criteria for the screeners and approving, you know, creating the list of screeners. But, you know, involvement from stakeholders is really important along all of this. Another example is that a few years ago, we passed a law that improved strengthened the teaching standards for reading. And so now all of these teacher prep programs are applying for their programs, and we are monitoring if their programs are in fact meeting these new standards. So you really have to get everyone involved for this implementation as well. And that includes the state boards of ed. We want them to be aware of what's going on and following this process. Because you can't lose sight of the laws. You really have to make sure they're followed through, or, you know, that doesn't really mean much.
Right. Absolutely. I think that is so critical, is to think about, you know, really the whole field and who needs to be included in this. Now, Brandy, I want to see if there's anything else that came in right now. Can you?
Yeah, so some of you are probably following in the chat. There was a question that came in asking if any of the state boards of education, any of you have been involved with, made learnings in teacher preparation programs focused on learning about dyslexia at the teacher prep level. So if anybody can talk about that part, that would be great. So again, teacher prep, was dyslexia included in any of the requirements, policy, efforts from state boards or in general?
I'm going to ask Jason if do you remember, were there pieces that included teacher preparation, possibly that pre-service or in service? Is that part of the legislation, or do you discuss that in your view of the bills?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've encouraged is a special endorsement for being able to identify that. But we passed a law back in 2019. It was Senate Bill 48, which is what created, and it, you know, back to Megan's point and to Kimber's point, the rollout of sometimes these policies. You know, you can't just do it overnight, right? So you pass a law, and typically in our state, the law gets signed and then becomes a law on July 1st. But there's a timeline. It doesn't happen that next school year, but a lot of people want to see that instant result. And so that bill was passed in 2019. It got signed into law, I think, in May or June, and it rolls out this school year, 2024. So, you know, how a bill becomes a law, we talk about that, you know, it's 5 years down the road. But one of the things it does is it requires every local system to have screeners, both universal screeners. That's another part of that we get to with some of the literacy laws that were passed last year, but particularly screeners that can identify dyslexia. And so that's something that we've encouraged. I believe our State Department is trying to find and is working with an RFP to try to find a universal free screener. I think some of the other systems, you know, that have the ability, we've tried to pare down a list of screeners. We've had some stakeholders that have reviewed them. There's been some disagreement on how many we need. And some states have 1, some have 3. I think we're at 8 now, or I think we were at 13 at one point. So we're trying to pare that list down. But, you know, I'm all for it if teachers want to continue to to understand more about that and get that certification. The issue being they're probably going to get moved to some other classroom. You know, they're going to be in high demand and high need if they do that, obviously. But that's an option here in Georgia.
Okay, perfect. And then Kareem, what do you see about teacher preparation? Kind of the same thing that Jason was talking about, like how do we look at that and then think about not just, you know, like you talked about the high quality instructional materials, but what does it look like for educators and for that system?
So really, this is all about the methods classes. When you're preparing teachers, I'm going to get very granular here. Usually you have a couple of methods classes, and you need to figure out, the question is, how can we make sure those methods classes align with the science of reading, of how children learn to read? That's really the issue. There are a lot of theory and you know, your philosophy of education and all kinds of statistics. There's a lot to it, but it's the methods where the rubber really meets the road. And right now in higher ed, we're all over the place, all over the place. Some of you may be familiar with a website called the National Council of Teacher Quality, where they go through a series of metrics to rate graduate programs and undergraduate programs on math, reading, etc. And they'll go through reading foundations, they go through the clinical experience, and they also go through classroom management. And they give them a score, A through F. There are some states like Mississippi where every institution of higher learning that they've scored have rated for reading foundations A, B, or C, or A+. That's for the entire state. Then you look at places like California, where we do have one A+. Shout out to Laverne College down in Southern California. We also have about 24 Fs.
Mm.
And for some school districts, that's every institution of higher learning that's close to them. So this is kind of the root of it. So if we're going to support students with dyslexia, and all students, but primarily, we have to make sure these methods classes align to the science and the research consensus. That falls on the deans. It falls on the president of the university or the chancellor. They have to be engaged on this, especially, and I know this is probably like an atomic bomb being dropped, but many of these institutions consider themselves to be, or are designated as being research institutions, Carnegie level, research 1, 2, or 3 level institutions. Now, if you're not familiar with higher ed, it's a big deal. That's their brand, that's their endowment, that's their status. They take it seriously, okay? How can you be a research institution, a Carnegie designated research institution, if your methods classes are not aligned to the research? In an area that has such importance and such impact on children, students with dyslexia, and also other students. And so there has to be some accountability for higher ed. That's really where the rubber meets the road, because we're continuing to create policies and shift in curriculum and all these other things. But if on an ongoing basis, the people who are tasked with serving students at the point of service have to unlearn the methods that they learned in their pre-service program, you're spending time, you're spending money, and there's no guarantee that that'll even take root. So that's really where to me, that's really, it's difficult because the higher ed is a tough nut to crack. But doggone it, if we're going to save our kids, we have to stand up for it. It's a civil rights issue and say enough. You have to leverage the research. If you're going to call yourself a research institution and raise money off of it, then you have to prepare our educators in a way that empowers them to serve children in tier 1 instruction, regardless of their learning profile or their neurological differences, etc. So that's really where the rubber meets the road, and it's up to us to hold our institutions accountable, especially the public universities who get public money.
Yes, thank you. And it's like, we have to kind of front load this. We have to get in front of it. We have to start there. This has been such a rewarding conversation, and I know that we're at time. There are a few questions that we have in the chat, and I know that Brandy has captured all of them. If we need to follow up with any of the panelists for specific answers to your questions, we will certainly do so. I'm going to ask Joey to come back. He's going to close us out for the session. And I know we also have his information we're going to drop into the chat for everyone as well. Before I do say goodbye, I would like to thank everyone who joined us, each of our panelists. Your expertise is so appreciated in this discussion. And I really do hope we can do it again. Joey, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Kimberly. I'd like to second that and just give a really big thank you to all of our panelists today. This has been an amazing presentation. Just a reminder, we will be sharing the link within the next week or so. It'll be on our website, and we'll be sending it out with email and everything. As a reminder, if you're a state board member wanting to learn more about dyslexia or engage your peer states, please reach out. I'll be including my email in the chat. And one final shout out, NASB is also hosting a webinar next month on state role in developing effective principles. So please come to that also if you're interested. One final thank you to our fantastic panel, and have a great day.